This bluish grey Volkswagen T-Roc might look a little bit like it's trying to camouflage itself into the classic sunny then cloudy Melbourne weather. But one place it's not trying to camouflage itself is at the shopping centre car park. In fact, for a small SUV that technically, and I'll come back to that, starts at under $40,000, this thing has a lot going for it. It's currently still in its first generation, but a couple of years ago, a facelift brought some of the older parts of this car up to scratch. And the parts that didn't really change, well, maybe that's not such a bad thing when it comes to Volkswagens. This variant specifically is the 110 TSI style, which, when you exclude the Performance R variant, is the mid-spec between the City Life base model and the R line. But is it a small SUV that could replace your trusty Japanese runabout? Stick with me and you'll find out.
The style starts from $38,890 before on-road costs, and while it features some older Volkswagen fit-out, it does come with a decent list of features. A set of 18-inch wheels, self-leveling headlights with cornering, cute DRLs, plus chrome highlights with black contrast trim are the best way to spot a style from the outside. Inside, there's an 8-inch touchscreen for multimedia, which is paired to the driver's digital Cockpit Pro display. That 8-inch screen is last-gen Volkswagen gear, but that's not a bad thing. There's also dual-zone climate control with an allergen filter, ambient lighting, a 6-speaker sound system, wireless phone charger, and wireless Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. The good news is you don't need to tick all or any of those option boxes for this to still be a compelling offering.
There are a few things on the T-Roc that make it sort of subtly stand out without being a bit garish or boring. One of them is these LED DRLs that surround where a vent would be on the Performance R variant, but I think the whole front end has quite a friendly look to it. One thing you do get on the style that you don't get on the City Life is these IQ Light headlights, which are LEDs that have things like corner lighting. But the other thing I think that is quite nice about this car that's sort of subtle is this petroleum blue paint. It's metallic. It's a $700 option according to the Volkswagen website, but so is any other color that isn't white. One thing you do get standard on the style though is this two-tone black roof with the black mirror caps here as well, plus those 18-inch alloy wheels. When you move a little bit further back on the car, you see these privacy glass tinted rear windows and the same thing at the back, plus up here, chrome roof rails, and once you get to the back of the car, a little bit of a sloped roofline with this spoiler here. It looks a little bit sporty, but overall I think the silhouette is some fairly standard small SUV stuff that looks quite nice. Inside the T-Roc, it's a little bit of an interesting dichotomy. Some of the stuff in here feels quite up to date and modern, and some of it might look to a trained eye a little bit more out of date. But I reckon even in here in the Volkswagen, some of that older stuff is actually quite good. In fact, in my personal opinion, some of the previous gen Volkswagen tech is actually more user-friendly than the stuff that's replaced it in the last couple of years, in newer models like the Mark 8 Volkswagen Golf. The other part of that dichotomy though is that while some of this is quite sleek and user-friendly, other parts of it like some hard scratchy surfaces and some materials that don't quite feel super premium aren't really up to scratch for a Volkswagen interior. The good points are that the tech in here is a perfect combination of physicality and digital experience, and by that I mean there are pretty much buttons for everything or some kind of quick shortcut to get to most of the controls you're really going to need. Volkswagen has kept for this car its buttons on the steering wheel. It hasn't adapted into the sort of haptic little touchpads that replaced some of the controls on some of its models. Even down here on the air conditioning climate controls, there's not physical buttons, but the ones that are here as little touchpad buttons are quite clear and they're easy to use. The sliders are very reactive. Up here, this 8-inch touchscreen for the multimedia is a little bit outdated in Volkswagen's world, but overall, still in terms of, other new cars, is quite good. It's fairly simple, it's well laid out, and it's not like one of those multimedia screens where there's a million buttons that makes it look a little bit like an iPad, but if you don't like it, you can still just bypass it with wireless Android Auto or Apple CarPlay. Another plus is the digital dash, which is here in front of me. It's very clear, it's quite wide, it's not too big though, and it's very adaptable and customizable. You can get it to show you pretty much whatever information you need without it getting too busy or cluttered. While the digital dash is similar to something that used to actually impress me quite a bit in high-end Audi models, something that doesn't feel super high-end is the material on the seats. This leather is actually a $3,500 option, and while it does make the driver's seat electrically adjustable and both front seats heated, it just doesn't feel like expensive leather. It feels a little bit cheap. Something else that's sort of surprisingly not super, doesn't feel well thought out in terms of the ergonomics is kind of this center bit here. While I am a fan of the angled away phone screen that's on the other side of the gear shifter, it's not a distraction and it's out of the way, and it's also right under these USB-C ports here. This section here feels a little bit poorly thought out. The bin here is pretty small, and this moves into where a water bottle would sit, and the actual cup holders here are quite odd shapes. This one's a little bit too big for most things, and this one's a little bit too small for most things. This water bottle is quite small, and this coffee cup is a pretty normal size and still sort of wobbles around in there. There's also a middle spot that looks about only as big as, you know, those normal energy can size things. Oh, and one last thing is up here, another option, according to the Volkswagen website, $2,000 for this sunroof. Automatically opening, closing, it's got a blind as well, and it's yours if you want it, but ultimately this is one option that comes down to taste rather than convenience. Back here is actually pretty good for a small SUV. If I was a kid, I'd have so much room back here, and I'd have my own little vent, little plug for probably something like an iPad, plus this for my elbows and an adjustable cup holder, which could probably be something that would be useful in the front. Unfortunately, I'm an adult, I have to pay taxes, and I have a little less space back here. So my headroom, legroom, footroom, all still fine. Nothing's really impeding the way I'm sitting, and this little headrest means it's actually quite soft too, means I'd have a pretty comfy ride on a long trip. The other thing is that these 60/40 split seats are the ones fitted with this, so if anything long needed to be loaded into the car, you could do that without having to fold all of the seats down. Also, the light back here is pretty good. The C-pillars are pretty thick, so a little bit less visibility back here, but with the sunroof, again, it's an option, but there's a lot of light back here and it feels fairly spacious. Back here behind the rear seats, boot space is pretty generous. You get 445 litres of boot space, and I assume that maximum comes thanks to this drop-down floor, which means you can either have the loading at like a flat boot up here with the lip, or drop it down for some larger, bulkier items. If you fold those rear seats down, you get 1,290 litres of space, and also, another plus, below that floor is a space-saver spare tyre rather than just a repair kit. Another thing is that this button here that closes the boot automatically for you, and the same thing when you open it, is a $600 cost option according to the Volkswagen website, but that's not too bad for the convenience you get over the lifetime of owning the car. Under here, it does what it says on the tin. 110 TSI means 110 kilowatts of Volkswagen engine, and in this case, that's a 1.4 litre turbocharged 4-cylinder. It also makes 250 Newton meters, and it drives the front wheels via an 8-speed torque converter gearbox, which will be good news to the ears of those who have been scorned by Volkswagen's previous DSG gearboxes. The claimed fuel efficiency for this engine is 6.3 litres per 100 Ks in this car, and even during my testing, I've only seen it go a little bit above that. In the real world, you'd expect it to be around probably 8 litres per 100 Ks, and that's about what I've been getting with some pretty spirited driving, so I'm pretty impressed by the actual real-world fuel efficiency of the T-Roc style. On top of being fairly efficient, the drivetrain in this T-Roc is also pretty nice to drive with. It feels like a good combination of the engine, gearbox, and its power delivery is pretty well tuned as well. Around suburban or urban areas with the drive mode set to just drive, it's actually quite smooth and calm without being lazy or feeling underpowered. 110 kilowatts doesn't sound like heaps, but the turbocharged engine does a pretty good job of using that torque from a pretty low down rev range. You can also knock the gear stick back and put it into sport, which makes the engine just sit at a little bit of a lower gear and a higher rev range. And when you're out in the countryside, it's actually quite fun to drive with. It's not too thrashy and it doesn't feel like it's being overworked, but it does give you a good bit of oomph when you need it coming out of a corner. Speaking of corners, the T-Roc handles pretty well and it feels a little bit more planted than its front drive nature would suggest to you. It's been raining during the time I've had this car on test, and even on wet days in the middle of corners coming out in, countryside roads where the roads might be a little bit rough or uneven, it's still pretty confidence inspiring, which is exactly what you want for a small SUV you might be driving your family around in. It handles well and feels nice and stable at high speeds, and around town its suspension does a good job of soaking up some of those city bumps you might come across, especially on roads where there are things like tram lines or crossing train tracks. The other thing I find fairly impressive about the T-Roc is actually its NVH. It stops vibrations from getting into the cabin, and things like wind noise or road noise don't really seem to be an issue in this car. Even with the radio on relatively quiet, I haven't noticed it anywhere that wouldn't affect any other car anyway. The steering too in this car is nice and smooth, it's communicative, and the setup in this car with its drive modes between comfort, eco and sport mean that you can individually set things like the steering and the way that the drivetrain responds individually from each other. The style also gets these paddles behind the steering wheel, which means I can bypass one of the small things I find a little bit annoying about this car, and that is that when you put the gear shift actual selector into manual mode by bumping it sideways, the way you select gears is kind of inverted from the way you would expect, bumping it towards you to shift down and away from you to shift up. Another small thing that bothers me about this car is that although its safety equipment overall is fairly non-intrusive, one thing that's a little bit overactive in my opinion is the automatic braking. I've found it with Volkswagen in the past, so it's not this car specifically, but things like a small hedge on the side of your driveway as you're backing in will cause the car to, even if you're not about to hit the brakes quite suddenly. And look, it's better than hitting something, but it's still a little bit frustrating when you're reversing and you know where you're going. The other thing about reversing is that the reversing camera in this car does look a little bit like you're playing a PlayStation 2 game. It's not the best quality video, but it's not terrible. It could just be a little bit better. In terms of that other safety stuff though, the cruise control automatic in this car is pretty good. It's well tuned, and things like the lane keep assist just gently sort of nudge you along the lanes rather than giving you a bit of a bump that feels a little bit jerky and sudden. So everything in this car is fairly well tuned and nothing is really too intrusive, just aside from that little reversing issue I was talking about before. It's not the most powerful car in its class, and it's also not the most dynamic in terms of being exciting, but it is fun and it's confidence inspiring. Everything about the T-Roc while you're driving it just feels sturdy, well built and solid. And if that's not a big plus, I don't know what is. I've already mentioned some of the safety features that the T-Roc gets, like its lane keep assist and the automatic braking on reverse if it detects an object. But in terms of things like airbags, the T-Roc gets driver and front passenger airbags, driver and front passenger side airbags, curtain airbags at the front and rear, plus with ANCAP back in 2017, it scored 5 stars under testing, albeit when the testing criteria wasn't quite as strict. The T-Roc also gets adaptive cruise control, automatic curb function, which is essentially the passenger mirror lowering to stop you from curbing your wheel, a distance warning display, driver fatigue detection, emergency assist, front assist with pedestrian monitoring, lane assist with lane departure warning, park assist for parking bay and parallel parking assistance, plus it has parking sensors at the front and rear. The T-Roc is covered by Volkswagen's pretty standard 5-year unlimited kilometre warranty, which is quite normal for the industry. Servicing, however, is probably on the more expensive side of what you might expect from a small SUV, but Volkswagen does have some care plans that you can buy ahead of time, costing, according to the Volkswagen website, $2,770 for this car, with the first service included for free. So that's the Volkswagen T-Roc, a little bit of Euro style that's still priced sharply enough to take on some rivals from Japan and Korea. Is it the cheapest small SUV in the market? Certainly not, but for what you get, it's priced quite sharply and it's far from the most expensive. And if you can refrain from ticking some of those option boxes, you'll probably find yourself feeling like you've got good value for money. Plus, it looks good doing it as well. If the feeling of a strong fit out and confidence-inspiring but fun drive is important to you, I reckon the Volkswagen T-Roc should be a pretty strong contender on your shopping list.